flight attendant poured coffee on black twins moments later. The pilot's response shocked everyone. "Black girls, this coffee could turn you white." The words came out in a mocking, venomous tone, cutting through the air with a cruel, deliberate sharpness. The flight attendant's face twisted into a smirk, her eyes gleaming with a disdain that no one should ever have to witness. She looked down at the two young black twins, sitting in their first-class seats, as if they were nothing more than objects to ridicule. Without hesitation, she grabbed the coffee pot, pouring the steaming hot liquid straight onto their laps. The sudden, searing pain from the coffee splashing on their skin made the twins cry out, their shock and confusion morphing into a deep, painful sting that went beyond the physical. The coffee soaked their clothes, the heat unbearable. But it wasn't just the burn, it was the insult, the humiliation, the blatant, in-your-face racism that cut through the air like a blade. "Maybe this will teach you your place," the flight attendant sneered, her tone dripping with malice. Her cruel laugh echoed through the cabin, loud enough for everyone to hear, as if this were a joke to her. The twins, stunned and disoriented, sat frozen in their seats, the pain of the coffee washing over them, but it was the sting of her words that cut deepest. They had come on this flight, paying for comfort, for a quick trip to care for their sick aunt, an emergency, something that should have been met with understanding and support. But here they were, humiliated and degraded by someone they should have been able to trust, someone whose job it was to ensure their safety and comfort. Around them, the rest of the passengers looked on in uneasy silence. Some gasped, some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. The room was filled with the echoes of injustice, but no one was ready to face it. What would the twins do next? Would they sit there and take it? Would they retaliate? The tension in the air was suffocating, and no one knew how it would unfold. But the real question was, what would happen when the situation escalated further? If you know that racism is not something to stand by and watch, but something to fight against, then you need to stay with us until the end. This story isn't just about what happened in the air, it's about standing up, taking action, and making sure this kind of injustice doesn't go unnoticed. Have you ever faced something like this? A moment where you felt the sting of racism, that gut-wrenching feeling of being treated like less than human? Or maybe you've witnessed someone standing up when no one else would. Tell us your story in the comments. When did it happen to you, and how did you handle it? Like, share, and subscribe to the Hyper Racism channel because we can't afford to ignore this anymore. These stories need to be told. Let's stand together, bring the truth to light, and make sure no one has to suffer in silence. The coffee was still steaming on the twins' laps, the burn lingering, but it was nothing compared to the burn of injustice that swelled inside them. They were only 14 years old, but they had already seen more than their fair share of the world's ugliness. Marissa and Monica, identical twins, both sharp, driven, and full of life, had always been the kind of girls who handled challenges with grace. But today, they were faced with something they never expected. The harsh sting of racial prejudice in an environment that was supposed to be their refuge. They sat there, the pain from the scalding coffee still fresh, their clothes soaked, their pride bruised. The flight attendant's cruel laughter still echoed in their ears. The humiliation was palpable. Yet, neither twin spoke. Neither cried out. They had both been taught to hold their composure, to rise above the insults, to keep going. But there was something about this moment, something that struck deeper than anything they'd ever faced before. They were supposed to be on their way to Chicago, where their Aunt Patricia, had fallen gravely ill. The news had come suddenly, an emergency that their father, Mr. James Carter, had not hesitated to address. The girl's mother had been in the hospital for weeks, recovering from her own medical issues, and Aunt Patricia had become their mother figure over the years. She had always been there for them when they needed her, a beacon of support. Now, it was their turn to return the favor. She was suffering from an advanced stage of cancer, a diagnosis that had shocked the family to its core. There was no time to waste, no time to let anything stand in their way. Their father, an accomplished entrepreneur, had made the decision to send them on this flight, booking them first-class tickets for comfort and speed. He was a man who always handled things with a level-headed, no-nonsense approach. But there was an underlying urgency in his decision to send the twins, The sudden, alarming reports of Aunt Patricia's worsening health had forced him to act quickly. The twins had always been close, but this trip meant more than just a visit. It was their chance to be there for the woman who had been there for them during their darkest times, and it was their father's way of giving them the space to care for her, away from the distractions of life back home. Mr. Carter had arranged everything. He'd made sure they were taken care of, that they had a safe, comfortable flight to Chicago so they could be with their aunt as quickly as possible. But now, their world had been flipped upside down. The flight was supposed to be an escape, a brief respite from the worry about Aunt Patricia's condition. But this wasn't the escape they imagined. This was a reminder that even in the most luxurious of settings, even in a place where they should feel safe, they could still be subjected to the harshness of a world that didn't always accept them. The flight attendant, whose name they had yet to learn, was a tall woman with sharp features, her expression one of indifference to the twins' plight. She was part of the elite crew meant to ensure passengers had a smooth, pleasant journey. Yet her actions spoke volumes. She didn't see the twins as people. She saw them as a threat to her narrow, distorted view of the world. Her discriminatory words, her actions, her entire demeanor screamed privilege. Her motivations were clear, to remind these young black girls that they didn't belong. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a calculated act of prejudice. Around them, the first-class cabin remained silent, the tension thick. The rich, plush seats, the polished wood accents, the luxuriously designed overhead bins, everything about this environment was meant to signal comfort, wealth, and power. But here, in this place, these twins were treated as less than human. The absurdity of it hit them like a wave, but they didn't react. Not yet. Marissa glanced over at Monica. Her sister's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to absorb the sting of what had just happened. But Monica was the more composed of the two. She had always known how to manage her emotions, to hide her feelings when necessary. But today, there was no hiding from this. "What should we do?" Monica whispered, her voice barely audible. Marissa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she just stared ahead, trying to steady her breathing. The pain in her lap, the sting of the coffee, and the word would fade with time. But the injustice? The hatred they'd just been subjected to? That would stay with them. That would be harder to shake. The flight attendant, still standing by the aisle, watched them with cold eyes. She didn't care that she had burned them, both physically and emotionally. She didn't care that they were two young women with hopes, dreams, and ambitions, just trying to be there for family. To her, they were just two black girls who had dared to sit in a place that didn't belong to them. The twins' composure was the only thing keeping them together. They had learned to keep their cool, to take the high road, but this time was different. This time, something deep inside them snapped. They were done being silent. As the plane soared through the clouds, heading toward Chicago, the twins could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. They didn't want to make a scene, but they were not going to let this go. The realization that they had been targeted, that they were viewed as less than, settled over them like a storm. But the storm wasn't over yet. It was about to get worse. They didn't know it yet, but something was about to happen that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. A voice, someone with authority, was about to step in. Someone who would finally make it clear that no one could get away with treating people this way. As they sat there, still in shock, the other passengers quietly observed. Some had begun to murmur amongst themselves, others had shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one moved. No one stepped in. No one intervened. But then the unexpected happened. What will the twins do next? Will they take matters into their own hands, or will they rely on someone else to stand up for them? And who will be the one to finally make a stand? The pain from the coffee had begun to settle, but the sting of the words and the cruel actions of the flight attendant remained fresh in their minds. Marissa and Monica sat in their first-class seats, the discomfort of the burned skin still lingering beneath the fabric of their clothes. They could feel the eyes of the passengers on them, some sympathetic, some avoiding the situation altogether. The flight attendant was still standing there, her posture smug, her smile still lingering, as if the humiliation she had caused was nothing more than a game to her. But what happened next wasn't what anyone, including the flight attendant, expected. Marissa, always the more composed twin, turned to her sister. "We've got to do something. We can't just sit here and let her treat us like this," she said, her voice low but firm. Monica nodded in agreement. She had been quiet up until this point, but the injustice had finally broken her silence. "No one should be treated like this. We paid the same fee as everyone else. Why should we be humiliated?" She turned to face the flight attendant, her voice now filled with a quiet yet unmistakable anger. The flight attendant's smirk faded as she realized the twins weren't backing down. "Why are you treating us like this?" Monica continued, her eyes locking with the flight attendant's. "We're not any different from anyone else on this plane. We paid the same price, sat in the same seats. So why do we have to endure this, just because of our skin color?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and forceful. The cabin was silent, the tension palpable. The other passengers were still watching, but no one spoke. Some were looking at the twins with sympathy, while others simply observed, unsure of how to react. The flight attendant's face reddened, and for a moment, she seemed caught off guard. It was clear the twins had expected her to dismiss them, to continue her cruel behavior without any consequences. But now, the power dynamic had shifted. Marissa leaned in slightly, her voice steady and strong. "We're not asking for special treatment. We're just asking for respect. We're human beings just like everyone else." The flight attendant opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't used to being challenged. She wasn't used to being called out for her behavior, especially not in such a direct and composed manner. For a brief moment, the tension between the twins and the flight attendant simmered. But then, just as the flight attendant was about to retort, something unexpected happened. A woman in the aisle, another passenger, spoke up. "She's right," the woman said, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "You can't treat them like this. This isn't just a joke. This is wrong." The flight attendant shot her a glare, but the woman stood her ground. She was in her early 30s, dressed in a business suit, clearly a professional. She had been watching the entire exchange with quiet anger. Monica looked at the woman, grateful for her intervention, but also a little stunned by the sudden shift. "Thank you," Monica said softly, her voice filled with a mix of surprise and appreciation. "But why did no one say anything before?" The woman shrugged, her gaze softening. "Sometimes people don't want to get involved. But this is different. This isn't just about you two. It's about all of us. We have to stand up against this kind of behavior, or it never stops." Marissa nodded, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. The calm composure that had been a part of their upbringing, instilled by their father to help them handle difficult situations, had not only kept them strong in the face of adversity, but it had also forced others to see the truth. The flight attendant, now visibly flustered, took a step back. She had no words to counter the twins or the growing crowd of passengers who were now murmuring in agreement. She hadn't expected to be confronted, let alone by two young black girls who had no intention of backing down. But just as the moment seemed to shift in the twins' favor, the flight attendant's icy demeanor returned. "I'm going to report this," she said, her voice tight with anger. "You can't speak to me like that." The tension in the air thickened. Marissa and Monica exchanged glances, and for a brief second, they questioned whether this was going to escalate even further. But they had come too far now. "We're not asking for a fight," Marissa said, her voice still steady but unwavering. "We're just asking for the respect we deserve." Just as it seemed like the situation would spiral into something more volatile, a voice over the intercom cut through the tension. The pilot's voice was calm, yet there was a sense of urgency in his tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a slight delay. Please remain in your seats. We'll be on our way shortly." The announcement was vague, but the flight attendant's face went pale as she glanced nervously toward the cockpit. The passengers in the cabin exchanged uneasy looks, but no one seemed willing to say anything more. What had just been a humiliating moment for the twins had quickly become something much larger. It was no longer just about them, it was about everyone in that cabin who had witnessed the blatant racism and remained silent. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it felt uncomfortable. But what would happen next? Would the flight attendant get away with this? Or would someone finally step in and do what needed to be done? Would the pilot's intervention be enough to force the situation to a resolution, or was something else waiting to unfold? And the bigger question, who else on this plane would stand up for what's right when it was their turn to speak? Stay tuned. This story is far from over. Have you ever been in a situation like this, where you were treated unfairly or witnessed someone else being treated unfairly because of their race? What did you do? Were you brave enough to speak up, or did you stay silent? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. The flight attendant, now visibly agitated, continued to stand in the aisle, her eyes locked on the twins with a look of disdain that never seemed to falter. The murmurs from the passengers grew louder, but the flight attendant wasn't backing down. Her earlier actions, meant to humiliate and belittle, had been met with resistance that she hadn't anticipated. The atmosphere felt thick, heavy, as if everyone knew the turning point had arrived. For a brief moment, it seemed like nothing was going to happen. The flight attendant stood there, stubborn, with her arms crossed in front of her chest, as if daring anyone to challenge her. But the moment the pilot's voice came over the intercom, it was like a match had ignited a powder keg. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a slight delay due to some ongoing situations in the cabin. I kindly ask that everyone remain seated while we address the matter. Thank you for your patience." The calmness in his voice didn't match the gravity of the moment. It wasn't just a routine announcement, it was a signal that something serious was about to happen. The passengers were silent, their eyes flickering nervously toward the cockpit. Was the captain going to just let it slide? Seconds passed in eerie silence, and then, the cabin door opened. The flight attendant looked toward the cockpit, still holding that cocky posture, as if daring the captain to take action. She didn't move from her position, clearly unfazed, even after the pilot's earlier announcement. But when Captain Harris, a seasoned pilot with over 20 years in the air, stepped into the cabin, the entire atmosphere shifted. He was a man with a calm, yet unmistakable authority. As he walked down the aisle toward the twins, his footsteps echoed, quiet but firm. The passengers all held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. He approached the flight attendant first, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I need you to step aside," he said, his tone clear and commanding. "Now." The flight attendant stood her ground, her arms still folded, her expression one of defiance. "I'm just doing my job," she snapped. "These girls need to understand their place." Captain Harris didn't flinch. His gaze hardened, and the moment the flight attendant spoke those words, something inside him clicked. "No, you're not doing your job. You're humiliating these young women. And that is not acceptable. Not in my cabin. Not under my watch." His voice rose just enough to command attention, but it was controlled, measured. The kind of calm anger that only comes from years of experience handling crises. The flight attendant's face reddened, but she didn't back down. "They shouldn't have been sitting here in the first place. They don't belong in first class." "Enough." Captain Harris's voice cut through her words, finally drowning out her protestations. "You have two options here. Step away, or I will have you escorted off this plane." The tension was electric. The flight attendant, who had been holding her ground so strongly moments ago, looked around the cabin, seeing the eyes of the passengers locked on her. She faltered. Her pride, her prejudice, it all hung in the balance. But the pilot wasn't done. "You are here to serve. Your job is to ensure everyone's safety and comfort, not to judge them based on the color of their skin, not to humiliate anyone." The words hit her like a slap in the face. For the first time, she seemed genuinely unsure of herself. She blinked, as if realizing that what had started as an insignificant moment of cruelty was now spiraling out of her control. "I will not have you disrespecting passengers in my plane, especially not because of their race. You are a flight attendant, not a judge, and this is a violation of every standard this airline claims to uphold." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, it looked as if the flight attendant would argue back, but she didn't. Instead, she turned on her heel, her face a mixture of humiliation and anger, and walked down the aisle toward the rear of the plane, no longer daring to challenge the captain's authority. The passengers, who had been too afraid to speak up before, now let out a collective breath. Some exchanged nods, others exchanged silent glances of approval. But the tension was far from gone. It had merely shifted. Captain Harris turned back to the twins, his expression softening for the first time since he stepped onto the plane. "Are you both all right?" he asked, his voice now gentle. Monica nodded, her face flushed from the embarrassment but also from the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. "We're fine, thank you. But I don't understand why she thought it was okay to treat us like that." The captain's gaze hardened again, this time filled with resolve. Because racism still exists, even in places where people think they're above it. But that ends here. Not under my watch. Marissa, who had been silently fuming the entire time, felt something shift in her as well. She had wanted to speak out, wanted to fight back, but her calmness had held her back. Now, she was beginning to realize that it was more than just standing up for herself, it was standing up for everyone who had ever been discriminated against. "Thank you," Monica said quietly, her voice steady now. "We're not going to forget this." Captain Harris gave them a small nod before turning to address the rest of the cabin. "I've spoken to the flight crew. The rest of the flight will be uneventful, and we'll make sure this doesn't happen again. I expect all of you to respect one another as human beings. No exceptions." He turned on his heel and walked back toward the cockpit, leaving a trail of silence in his wake. But as he disappeared behind the curtain, the weight of what had just happened settled in the cabin. The power had shifted. The flight attendants' actions had been challenged, and now, the dynamic of the flight was forever altered. But the real question lingered. What would happen when they landed? Would there be consequences? Would the airline back the flight attendants' actions, or would this be the start of something bigger? And for the twins, what would this moment mean for them? Would they keep their composure, or would the injustice they'd faced change them forever? The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The plane was quiet for only a moment after Captain Harris returned to the cockpit. But the unease still lingered in the air, thick with tension. The flight attendant had retreated to the back of the cabin, but her smoldering resentment was far from extinguished. The murmurs of the passengers began to rise, slowly at first, but soon enough, it became clear that the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Marissa and Monica sat in their seats, still reeling from what had just happened. The pain from the scalding coffee had begun to fade, but the emotional toll lingered. The twins exchanged a look. They'd never expected to face something like this, not on a plane, and certainly not when they were simply trying to get to Chicago to care for their sick aunt. Their composure, their calm, had been their shield, but it wasn't enough. The flight attendant had crossed a line, and there was no going back from it. As the minutes passed, it became more and more evident that the confrontation wasn't over. The flight attendant had slunk to the back, but she didn't bow. She didn't apologize. She didn't even acknowledge the gravity of the situation. Instead, she fumed quietly, holding on to her wounded pride, nursing her anger like a venomous snake ready to strike again. But the plane wasn't just silent in the wake of her exit. Something was building in the cabin. A sense of solidarity among the passengers. The whispers had begun to grow louder. Some were angry, others just disappointed, but all of them shared one thing in common. They were done watching racism go unchecked. It started with a quiet voice near the back. An older man, likely in his 50s, leaned forward in his seat, his eyes fixed on the back of the plane where the flight attendant was standing. "I've seen something like this before," he muttered, shaking his head. "Not the same, but close enough. And let me tell you, it doesn't end well when you let it go on." Others in the cabin turned to him. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular, but his words hit home for those who'd been too uncomfortable to speak up earlier. The sense of camaraderie was growing, but it was still a quiet, careful tension. Then, a woman from the row across from the twins stood up and turned to the man who had spoken. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the injustice in the air. "What happened to you?" The man's eyes softened, and he looked at the woman for a moment before sighing. "It was years ago, but I was on a flight from Atlanta to New York. Same thing. A black woman and her daughter were humiliated by a flight attendant, just like these girls. It wasn't as overt, but the way the flight attendant treated them, the way she looked down on them, it was racism, Plain and simple. Monica glanced at Marissa. The words were like a punch in the stomach. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This wasn't just about them. This was part of a pattern, something that people had been dealing with, silently suffering from, for far too long. What happened? Marissa asked, her voice low but urgent. The man leaned forward again, and the passengers around him leaned in, captivated by his story. The woman and her daughter didn't stay quiet. They stood up. They called the flight attendant out, just like these girls did. It wasn't easy. The flight crew tried to brush it off, tried to protect their own. But the passengers? We made sure the flight attendant was held accountable. We filed complaints, we spoke to the airline, and we demanded a change. It wasn't just about one person. It was about something bigger than that. His words hung in the air. The weight of his experience, the sense of community that began to form around him, was palpable. The airline issued an apology, but it didn't stop there. The flight attendant was reassigned. That's what happens when you call out injustice. The cabin fell silent. The realization hit everyone at once. This wasn't just the twins' battle. It was the battle of everyone who had ever been wronged, who had ever felt the sting of racism in a place where they should have been safe. And now, the passengers weren't just witnesses, they were participants. Another passenger, a man in his 30s with a corporate appearance, stood up, his voice strong. You're right. I've been discriminated against on flights before. It wasn't as blatant as what we're seeing today, but I was dismissed, ignored, and belittled because of my ethnicity. And when I spoke up, when I demanded respect, I was told I was overreacting. We can't stand by anymore. We can't allow this. The plane seemed to hold its breath. It was clear, this wasn't just a disagreement between a flight attendant and two young women. This was a societal issue unfolding in real time. The power dynamics were shifting, and everyone in the cabin could feel it. The flight attendant, still seething in the back of the plane, had no idea what was about to happen. Her words and actions had set something into motion, and now she was about to face the full force of it. Captain Harris's voice came over the intercom again, calm but laced with authority. This is Captain Harris again. I'm aware of the situation that's been unfolding in the cabin. The flight attendant in question has been removed from her position. The airline will be handling this situation with the seriousness it deserves. Please stay seated while we sort this out. For a moment, the entire cabin was silent. The flight attendant's influence had crumbled. The passengers, once passive, once silent, had become an active part of this fight for justice. The power had shifted. But it wasn't over. Not yet. As the tension simmered, the flight attendant's anger boiled over. She marched down the aisle, her eyes burning with rage. You don't know what you're doing, she spat, her voice rising. You think this is some kind of joke? You think you can challenge me? You're nothing. Just like them. You're all the same. Her words hung in the air, filled with malice. The passengers recoiled, the tension in the cabin at its peak. The flight attendant was on the edge, losing control of everything she thought she had. But just as she was about to lash out again, something unexpected happened. A passenger, someone they hadn't seen before, stood up, their voice sharp and unwavering. You're wrong, they said, their eyes filled with quiet fury. You don't get to treat anyone like that. Not anymore. Not on this plane, not in this world. The confrontation was about to reach its boiling point, and the flight attendant was losing control. What would she do next? Would she lash out even more recklessly? Or would she face the consequences of her actions? The stakes were higher than ever before. Will justice be served, or will this flight attendant get away with it? The tension in the cabin reached a boiling point. The flight attendant, her anger bubbling to the surface, marched down the aisle with reckless fury, her eyes burning with humiliation and resentment. Her earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, determined glare. The power she had once felt in the control of her position was slipping through her fingers, and she could sense it. But she wasn't ready to let go just yet. As she neared the twins, still seated with their backs straight, their posture defiant, the room fell into an almost unnatural silence. The moment hung thick in the air, as though everyone in the cabin was holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. You think you've won, huh? The flight attendant's voice was venomous, her words dripping with disdain. You think that just because the captain said something, that makes it right? You're nothing. Just two girls who think they deserve more than they do. And you. Before she could continue, the unmistakable voice of Captain Harris interrupted her, cutting through the growing tension like a sharp blade. That's enough. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who had reached their limit. The entire cabin shifted, all eyes now locked on the captain, who was stepping back into the fray with a look of sheer resolve. The flight attendant froze, her anger still boiling but now masked by fear. This wasn't just a captain asking for calm, this was the man in charge, and he wasn't going to let her humiliation of the twins slide. You've made a terrible mistake, Captain Harris continued, his voice steady and unwavering, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that none of the passengers could ignore. I won't let you disrespect these girls any longer. Not on my watch. The flight attendant opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She was taken aback by the force of the captain's words. You humiliated them. You poured hot coffee on them. You insulted them because of their skin color, and you thought you could get away with it. His voice was rising now, full of righteous anger. You thought you could walk away from this, but you're not walking anywhere. Not until you face the consequences. A murmur ran through the passengers. Whispers filled the cabin, their eyes bouncing between the captain and the flight attendant. This was no longer just a confrontation between the girls and the crew, it had escalated to something far greater. A moment of justice was unfolding before their eyes. The flight attendant's face went pale. The smirk, the arrogance, the belief that she was untouchable, all of it began to crumble in the face of the captain's unyielding confrontation. You think this is over? She snapped, her voice now laced with desperation. You think I'm the only one who feels this way? You think this is just about me? Captain Harris took a step forward, his eyes hardening with the weight of his responsibility. Yes, it is just about you. Because you were the one who decided to make them feel less than. You were the one who crossed the line, and now you'll answer for it. The flight attendant looked around, her face flushed with frustration and anger. The passengers, who had once been silent bystanders, now seemed to rally around the captain's words. They weren't willing to let this moment pass quietly. They weren't willing to let this injustice stand without being called out. A young woman in the middle of the cabin stood up, her voice firm but emotional. I've been treated like that before, she said, her voice trembling but strong. Not here, not on a plane, but I've had people like her treat me that way. We can't just let it happen. She turned to the twins. I'm with you. We're with you. More people began to speak up, their voices building in solidarity. Some told stories of their own experiences with racism, others of witnessing similar acts of prejudice that had gone unchallenged. The entire cabin seemed to come alive, the passengers now united in their desire for justice. The flight attendant, who had once felt powerful in her superiority, now stood alone in her shame. She looked around at the growing support for the twins, her anger now mixed with panic. She had thought she could humiliate them, break them, make them feel powerless. But now, the power had shifted, and she was the one who felt small. She started, her voice faltering. But she didn't finish the sentence. She couldn't. There was no excuse. She knew it and everyone else knew it too. The captain stepped forward again, his words firm. We don't tolerate this behavior on this airline. You've crossed a line, and now, you will face the consequences of your actions. I'm having you removed from this flight. You are no longer part of this crew. The flight attendant opened her mouth to protest, but the captain wasn't finished. I will ensure that the airline holds you accountable. You will not be flying another flight. You will not get away with this. And I will make sure everyone knows why. With that, the flight attendant, her face red with embarrassment, turned and walked down the aisle, her head bowed. The door to the galley opened, and she disappeared behind it, her future uncertain. The passengers, once passive, had shifted the power in the cabin. They had spoken out, they had supported the twins, and now, the flight attendant had faced the consequences. For a moment, the cabin was quiet. The atmosphere had changed completely. The weight of the confrontation, the words that had been exchanged, lingered in the air. But this was not the end. Captain Harris turned to the twins. His voice softened, though still filled with authority. "Are you both okay?" Monica nodded slowly, her face flushed with emotion. She wasn't sure whether she was relieved or still angry, but the feeling of powerlessness was gone. "We're fine," she said, her voice steady now. "Thank you. For everything." The captain nodded, his gaze lingering on the twins. He could see the strength in them, the resilience. "It's not over," he said quietly. "But you've got a whole cabin behind you now. People are listening. And that's where change starts." As he turned to leave, the twins sat back in their seats, the weight of everything they had just endured settling over them. For the first time since this nightmare had started, they felt a sense of hope. A sense that maybe, just maybe, things were changing. They weren't alone in this fight anymore. But just as they thought the worst was behind them, the captain's voice came over the intercom once more, calm, but heavy with what he knew had just transpired. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience during this unfortunate delay. We'll be departing shortly, and I expect a smooth and respectful flight from here on out. I ask that we all treat each other with kindness and respect." But as the plane began to move again, a new question hung in the air. Would this moment of justice spark a wave of change? Or would the passengers simply go back to their lives, forgetting the importance of standing up when it matters most? As the plane climbed higher into the sky, the tension that had gripped the cabin began to ease. But the fight for justice was far from over. What would happen next? Would the airline's response be enough to hold the flight attendant accountable, or was this just the beginning of something even bigger? The twins were left wondering, had they truly won, or was this just the first step toward something far more dangerous? The flight had returned to some semblance of normalcy after the incident, but the atmosphere still buzzed with the electric tension that had been unleashed. Marissa and Monica sat side by side, their backs straight, their hearts still pounding. The humiliation from earlier, being drenched with hot coffee by the flight attendant, was still fresh in their minds, but there was also something else now. Something that had shifted inside them. As the plane soared higher, heading toward Chicago, the twins reflected on the events of the day. How had this happened? They had always been taught to believe in fairness, to treat everyone equally, regardless of their skin color. In school, they had never truly understood the depth of racism, not because it didn't exist around them, but because they had always been shielded from it. They had white friends, people who treated them with kindness, with respect. They had never imagined that such blatant prejudice, such cruelty, still existed in the world they lived in. But today had shattered that illusion. Today, they faced racism in a way they could not have anticipated. Monica spoke first, breaking the silence between them. "I never thought something like this would happen to us. Not in a million years." Her voice was steady, but the hurt was still there. "We always had friends in school, white friends, who treated us well. We were always told that we were equals. But today was different. It was real." Marissa nodded, her gaze fixed on the window as the city lights of Chicago slowly came into view. "I never imagined it would happen like this. I thought maybe racism was something of the past, something we were past, you know?" She paused, her hand tightening around her seatbelt. "But that woman, she didn't see us as people. She saw us as less. Just because of the color of our skin." Their words hung in the air, unanswered questions filling the space between them. "What do we do now?" Monica asked quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "Is this the world we live in?" Before Marissa could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing in Chicago shortly. Please prepare for arrival." But to the twins, the announcement wasn't the only thing that brought a sense of closure. It was the realization that, while the situation on the plane had been handled, the fight for justice didn't end here. It had only just begun. As the plane descended into Chicago, the cabin remained eerily quiet. But the silence wasn't just from the tension. It was from the weight of what had happened. The flight attendant's actions had exposed something far deeper than just a personal confrontation. It had brought to the surface the ugly reality of racial prejudice that many people, like the twins, had never truly had to face. "We can't let it go," Marissa whispered, her voice resolute. We can't just walk away and forget what happened. Not this time. Monica nodded, her expression set. We won't. The plane finally touched down on the tarmac, and the passengers began to gather their things. The twins could feel the weight of the moment still pressing down on them. But as they disembarked, something extraordinary happened. The crowd of passengers who had witnessed the confrontation, those who had spoken out, those who had supported them, began to approach the twins as they moved down the jet bridge. You did the right thing, a middle-aged woman said, giving them an encouraging nod. You stood up when others wouldn't. You gave us all a voice. Another man, tall and dressed in a business suit, stopped in front of them, his expression serious but kind. I've never seen something like that. What happened today was wrong, and I'm glad the captain stepped in. But it wouldn't have happened without you two speaking up. You showed us what it means to stand for justice. The twins were surprised by the support. The passengers who had been too afraid to speak up during the incident had now found their voices. They had become allies in a moment of shared understanding. It was a moment of solidarity, a reminder that change doesn't just happen in one place. It happens when people rise together. But the flight attendant, the woman who had started it all, was nowhere to be seen. She had been escorted off the plane before it had even landed, her fate sealed. The twins knew that the consequences she faced would follow her. As they made their way out of the terminal, the weight of the experience finally began to sink in. But there was still one thing that needed to happen. The twins had already begun filing complaints with the airline, with the help of the passengers who had spoken out for them. They knew the company had a responsibility to act. They weren't going to let this injustice go unnoticed, not when it had affected so many people, not just them. They were going to make sure that no one else had to endure what they had been subjected to. Justice was served today, Monica said quietly, her voice filled with conviction. But it's not over. It's just the beginning. They knew that this battle wasn't over. The fight for respect, for equality, was far from won. It was going to take more than just one confrontation on a plane. It was going to take action, and it was going to take voices willing to speak out, even when it wasn't easy. But as they stepped out of the airport, the twins realized something. They had faced a moment of injustice, and they had fought back. They had shown the world that standing up for what's right was never easy, but it was always worth it. They had been hurt. They had been humiliated. But now, they had a sense of empowerment. They had made a stand. It's going to take all of us, Marissa said as they walked out of the terminal. But we'll get there. We have to. And with that, they stepped into the world outside, ready for whatever came next. But the question remained, would the airline's actions be enough to set a precedent? Would the flight attendants' actions be exposed for all to see, or would this be swept under the rug? Stay tuned. This fight is far from over. Have you ever faced a moment of racial injustice or witnessed someone who did? How did you handle it? Did you speak up? Tell us your story in the comments. As the twins made their way out of the airport, a strange sense of relief washed over them, tempered by the realization that the events of the day were far from over. What had happened on the plane? The confrontation, the stand taken by Captain Harris, the passengers who spoke up in solidarity, had been a powerful moment, one that would stay with them forever. But there was still much left to be done. Later, as they sat together in the waiting area, reflecting on what had unfolded, it became clear that the situation had not ended with the captain's intervention. The flight attendant had attempted to deny the allegations against her. She had tried to dismiss the accusations as misunderstandings, claiming that her actions were misinterpreted. But the evidence was overwhelming. Passengers had stepped forward, some providing recorded footage on their phones, others recounting exactly what they had seen. The truth was undeniable. The twin girls had been subjected to blatant racial discrimination, and the entire cabin had witnessed it. The flight attendants' efforts to cover it up were futile, as more and more people testified, their voices echoing in the small, tight-knit space of the cabin. The evidence was irrefutable, and the airline had no choice but to act. But the moment of justice wasn't just about the flight attendants' termination or the legal actions that followed. It was about something bigger, something far more significant than any one individual's actions. Monica sat quietly, her thoughts racing. It wasn't just about us, she said after a long pause, her voice steady, but filled with the weight of understanding. It was about everyone who had ever been in our shoes. Everyone who's been made to feel like they don't belong just because of the color of their skin. Marissa nodded, her eyes focused on the floor as she reflected. You're right. If it weren't for the passengers who spoke up, this would have just been another incident swept under the rug. The truth might have been hidden, and no one would have learned anything. But those people we didn't even know, they stood up for us when we needed it. They didn't stay silent. They acted. The twins sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day's events settling in. That's what makes the difference, Marissa continued, her voice filled with a quiet sense of purpose. It's not enough to just sit back and hope things get better. People have to take action. They have to speak up when they see something wrong. The importance of support, of having people stand up for you when the world feels like it's stacked against you, was something the twins hadn't fully realized before that moment. In their minds, they had always thought of themselves as capable, strong enough to face adversity alone. But now they saw the power of unity. The passengers who spoke up, who shared their stories, who stood with them, they had been the key to exposing the injustice. Without their support, it might have been easy for the flight attendants' actions to go unnoticed, for the girls to be dismissed as overreacting or making a scene. But that wasn't the case. This moment had reminded them of something fundamental. Racial discrimination wasn't something anyone should stand idly by and tolerate. Whether it happened on a plane, in a workplace, or on the streets, the injustice of it could not be ignored. But equally important was the recognition that change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when people refuse to be passive, when they demand justice and equality, even when it's uncomfortable. Monica leaned back in her seat, staring out the window at the darkening sky. I keep thinking, what would the world be like if more people acted like that? What if everyone stood up when they saw someone being treated unfairly, no matter who they were or where they came from? She paused, her voice soft. What if we all stopped pretending like racism was something that didn't exist anymore, and just did something about it? Marissa's eyes flickered with a sense of resolve. That's what makes the difference. If more people did what those passengers did, if more people acted like that, maybe the world would be different. Maybe we wouldn't have to deal with this kind of stuff in the first place. They sat together in quiet contemplation, their thoughts reflecting the weight of what they had learned, what they had witnessed. The fight for justice, for racial equality, wasn't just about the big moments. It was about the small actions, the daily efforts to speak out, to show support, to demand change when it's needed most. The twins had learned that lesson the hard way, but they weren't going to forget it. And that was the key. Standing up for justice wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a choice that had to be made every day. Whether it was big or small, whether it was confronting blatant acts of racism or calling out microaggressions, the power to create change lay in the collective efforts of everyone who refused to stay silent. We're part of that change now, Monica said softly. We'll keep speaking up. We'll keep doing what we can to make sure this doesn't happen again. Marissa smiled, a small but determined smile. We have to, because if we don't, who will? As the twins walked away from the airport, ready to finally visit their sick aunt and put this chapter of their lives behind them, they knew one thing for certain. They had been part of something bigger than themselves. The power of speaking out, of standing up against injustice, had been proven in that moment. And they weren't going to let it go. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Have you ever had someone stand up for you when you needed it most? Or maybe you've been the one to speak out against injustice. What would the world look like if more people acted like that? Let us know in the comments. The weeks following the flight were a whirlwind for Marissa and Monica. Their journey to Chicago to care for their sick aunt had been clouded by the traumatic experience on the plane, but they had pushed through. Aunt Patricia, still recovering from the devastating effects of cancer, needed them more than ever, and despite everything they had faced, the twins found strength in caring for her. The long hours spent by her bedside, tending to her needs and listening to her stories, provided a sense of grounding. The pain of the flight attendants' cruelty started to fade in the face of their family's love and the resilience they were learning to tap into. But the events on that plane were far from forgotten. The twins stayed with their aunt for several weeks, comforting her, making sure she had everything she needed. Still, in the back of their minds, the events aboard that flight lingered. They had been the victims of a system that allowed people like the flight attendant to exist unchecked. Yet, through it all, they realized something important. Their battle for justice was far from over. Back at home, the fallout from the incident on the plane had spread like wildfire. The story had made its way into the media, attracting the attention of people across the country. Social media platforms were buzzing with people sharing their own experiences of racial discrimination. Hashtags like Justice for the Twins and Stand Up for Justice trended for days. The airline, pressured by public outrage and the overwhelming evidence of the flight attendant's actions, had no choice but to take swift action. The flight attendant, whose name had now been made public, was officially fired. The airline issued a formal statement, claiming that her actions were completely unacceptable and against company policy. But the consequences didn't end there. The flight attendant faced additional disciplinary actions. She was banned from working in the airline industry altogether after her discriminatory behavior was deemed a clear violation of not just company policy but also anti-discrimination laws. Her reputation had been irreparably tarnished. What had once been a secure career, one where she could act with authority, was now nothing more than a distant memory. She had lost her job, her livelihood, and the respect she once had. But the worst consequence wasn't just the loss of her position, it was the public shame she would carry for the rest of her life. For a brief time, she became a symbol of the ugliness that still festered in society. Her name was plastered across news outlets, trending on social media, and splashed across headlines. She had become the face of bigotry, and the world wasn't going to let her forget it. Yet, it wasn't just her who was affected. The entire airline industry felt the backlash. There were public protests outside the airline's offices, petitions calling for greater accountability, and calls for stricter policies on racial discrimination. The airline was forced to confront the fact that, despite its claims of inclusivity, it had failed to hold its employees accountable for actions like this. But Marissa and Monica's fight for justice didn't stop there. They were determined to make sure that their voices were heard, to ensure that something good came from their experience. In the weeks following the incident, they became more active in their community, speaking out about racial discrimination and the importance of standing up for what's right. They participated in local town halls, sharing their story with anyone who would listen, encouraging others to use their voices and stand firm against injustice. The twins were not just advocating for themselves anymore, they were advocating for everyone who had ever felt powerless, everyone who had ever been treated unfairly simply because of the color of their skin. One day, just a week after their return to Chicago, they received an unexpected call. It was from Captain Harris, the man who had stepped in when the situation was at its breaking point. He told them that the airline was now implementing new anti-discrimination policies in response to the incident, policies that would be enforced across every department. These included mandatory diversity training for all employees, as well as a zero-tolerance policy for any form of discrimination. "I wanted you to know that you too made a difference," Captain Harris said. "Your courage in speaking up for yourselves has sparked a change in this company. They're listening now." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The twins had made a lasting impact, not just on their flight, but on the airline and everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. They had ignited a fire that could no longer be ignored. And it wasn't just the airline that was changing. The world around them was shifting as well. More and more people were speaking out against racial injustice, joining in solidarity with the twins and others who had faced similar experiences. The twins' social media profiles began to fill with messages of thanks, of people sharing their own stories of facing prejudice and finding the strength to speak up. They realized that their fight wasn't just their own. It was part of a much larger movement, one that was slowly but surely pushing for change. The twins had unwittingly become symbols of courage, of standing up against the tide of hate that still ran through society. But even with all the positive momentum, the girls couldn't shake the thought of the flight attendant, the woman who had treated them with such cruelty. What would happen to her now? Had she learned anything from her public shaming? Would she regret her actions? Or would she continue to hide behind her prejudice, unrepentant? The aftermath had been a victory for the twins. Justice had been served, but in the back of their minds, the deeper question remained: had anything truly changed? Had this single incident made a lasting difference? Or was it just a fleeting moment that would be forgotten with time? As they sat together in their aunt's hospital room, their thoughts turned inward. Their fight for justice had reignited something inside them. A sense of purpose, a commitment to ensuring that people would no longer be allowed to remain silent in the face of discrimination. They looked at each other, the bond between them stronger than ever. They knew they couldn't rest until they had done everything in their power to make sure that no one ever had to face what they had gone through on that plane again. "We've got to keep going," Marissa said softly, her voice resolute. "We've got to keep fighting for people who can't fight for themselves." "Yeah," Monica agreed, a determined spark in her eyes. "Because if we stop now, what was it all for?" And so they would. The fight wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of emotions for Marissa and Monica. Their time in Chicago, spent caring for their sick aunt, had given them some peace, yet their thoughts kept returning to the events on the plane. They couldn't help but reflect on the way their fight for justice had ignited something much bigger than they ever anticipated. What had started as a personal confrontation, one that was intended to humiliate them, had turned into a pivotal moment in the ongoing struggle against racial injustice. They had stood up for themselves, and in doing so, had inspired a ripple of change. The flight attendant's actions had not only cost her job but had sparked a conversation, a movement, really, that couldn't be ignored. The twins had witnessed firsthand the power of speaking up, of refusing to stay silent when faced with hate. They had also seen how much stronger they were when they had others beside them, standing up against the tide of prejudice. In the days that followed, Marissa and Monica were approached by people from all walks of life, some who had been on that flight, others who had heard their story through the media. People shared their own experiences of discrimination, of standing up and being knocked down, but ultimately rising stronger. The twins had become symbols of hope, of courage, showing that even in moments of injustice, there was a chance for change if enough people chose to act. As they looked back on everything, it became clear to them that racial discrimination wasn't just something that could be fixed with one single victory. It wasn't something that could be wiped away simply by holding one person accountable. It was a systemic issue, deeply rooted in society, and it would take much more than an isolated confrontation to eradicate it. But that didn't mean the fight wasn't worth it. They knew the battle was far from over. Their own fight wasn't just about what had happened on the plane, it was about ensuring that no one, ever again, would have to endure such treatment. The fight for equality didn't end with the flight attendant's termination. It had just begun. The twins had become more than just victims. They had become warriors in a much larger battle for racial justice. Monica turned to her sister one last time before they left the hospital, their bags packed, ready to head back home. "We've come so far, haven't we?" she said, her voice filled with emotion. Marissa nodded, her eyes reflecting the wisdom she had gained. "Yeah, but this is only the beginning. It's going to take all of us, people like us, people who care about justice and equality, to make this world better. If we don't keep pushing for change, who will?" The journey they had undergone wasn't just about them. It was about everyone. Everyone who had been silent in the face of injustice, everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of their race. And it was about showing them that change could happen when people stood together, when they chose to speak up. Now, as they stood at the threshold of the airport, ready to return to their lives, they realized something. The true power didn't lie in a single victory, it lay in the people they had inspired along the way. Their fight wasn't just about what had happened on that flight, but about pushing for a world where this kind of discrimination was no longer tolerated. Thank you for watching. If you believe in fairness and equality, hit that like button, share the video, and subscribe for more. What would you have done in Marissa and Monica's shoes? Let us know in the comments. Do you think racial discrimination and prejudice can end? What do you think can be done to curb it? Do you think serving justice is enough to end it? Tell us your own opinion. And if you want racism to become a thing of the past in our country and world at large, if you want to be like Marissa and Monica, educating and raising awareness, then comment "End racial discrimination" in the comments below.